Hey guys, happy Sunday. I hope your weekend's been all right. Mine has too. I've stayed home most of the weekend because it's been raining. Raining in Northern California. Sucks, but we just have to do these things. Anyway, since it's Sunday, my name is Charlotte. I'm going to be your host for the next hour. And I'm also the owner of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team based out of Sacramento. We're 45 strong up and down the state, and we also have affiliates in Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and Hawaii. And if you're watching from Facebook and you like what you hear today, please be sure to hit that follow button and that like button. And if you're watching from YouTube, there's a little ghost at the bottom right hand corner. And click on that, and a little subscribe button will pop up. And that will be the way to subscribe and get all the alerts on our videos. How's that grab you? Anyway, excuse me, my nose is stuffed. Rain makes my nose stuffy. This is Reading Sunday, so we're going to be reading about the spirits of Christmas and the not so happy. Some happy, some not so happy. All right? Some stories are more cheerier than others. I'll warn you ahead of time. But this is our Sunday reading day. I read for about maybe a little under an hour, and then I let you go your merry way. So, as my regular intro says, be sure to get your slippers out and do whatever you need to do and grab your hot cocoa, sit by the fire, because it's Christmas time and we're reading, well, Christmas slash winter themed stories. So let me open up my antiquated, let me reach down here at my antiquated tablet, my antiquated Samsung, and we'll get on with today. And I hope you like what you hear. And I'm looking forward to a great week of shows too, by the way. And feel free to comment. Feel free to hit those like buttons. If, like I said, if you like what you hear, you can also find me on Instagram at GhostieGal, all lowercase. You can find us over at TikTok as California Haunts, all lowercase. You can find us on Twitter as Cal Haunts. So we're everywhere. We're on YouTube. We're everywhere. So check us out. Check us out. If you want, the easier way to find us on YouTube also is youtube.com/ at with that little ampersand thing, California Haunts Radio. It's that easy. So check us out. I tell you, there's over 450 videos sitting over there, and I think there'll be something that you like. Okay, let me get this set up here. It takes a minute. Like I said, this thing is antiquated. And we're going to continue. A sip of water real quick, too. It's dry under these lights, I'll tell you. See, there it is. Okay, so when we left off, we were just telling different various stories of tragedy that happened during the Christmas season and winter. And this is going to continue because now we're going to be talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor. That's where we're starting today. So December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy, began on a gorgeous sunny Sunday morning in Oahu, Hawaii. Some of the military personnel stationed at Pearl Harbor on Ford Island were sitting down at breakfast. Others were going about their usual morning routines. Perhaps a few were ruminating on the current world situation. In 1933, Japan had gone to war with China and was making noises about dragging the United States into the conflict. The top brass of the Navy decided to test Pearl Harbor's defensive capabilities. They staged a mock attack on the base. If the Navy was hoping to be encouraged by a ship-shaped responsive fighting force at the base, they were disappointed. The drill was a fiasco. The attackers mopped the floor with the defenders. And if it had been a real attack instead of a drill, the base would have been devastated. Oddly, though, not much was done to encourage the personnel to beef up their training and defenses. The Japanese kept rattling their swords, and the Navy kept the base at Pearl Harbor without any changes. On that Sunday morning in December, that lack of preparation led to tragedy. Kermit A. Tyler, a first lieutenant in the Army Air Force, was on duty at the Radar Information Center at Fort Shafter, also on Oahu. He got a puzzled message from a radar operator who was stationed on the northern tip of the island. The operator, Private Joseph Lockhart, reported that he and another private, George Elliott, had noticed an unusual blip on the radar that indicated a large number of aircraft headed toward the island. The radar indicated a group of planes about 130 miles away, coming in fast. "Don't worry about it," Tyler said. He thought the planes were a flight of American B-17 bombers that was due in from the mainland. Those words were to haunt Tyler for the rest of his life. 45 minutes later, the first of two waves of Japanese aircraft arrived at Pearl Harbor. Bombs rained down on the unsuspecting base, turning the peaceful Sunday morning into a scene of confusion, terror, fire, and blood. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service sent 360 planes to destroy the base, with 48 waiting in the wings for aerial combat. The first wave was the primary attack, intended to catch the American forces off guard. The second wave had specific objectives. They were to attack aircraft carriers first, then cruisers, and finally battleships. The Japanese aircraft were a savage array of firepower, fighter planes, torpedo bombers, and dive bombers that concentrated their fire on ground targets. The morning exploded in a hail of bullets, bombs, and shrapnel. Explosions shivered the blue water. Panic and flames swept the base. None was spared. Women, civilians, nurses, all fell in the hail of destruction. When it was over, Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. All 8 of the U.S. Navy battleships at the base were damaged, and 4 of them were sunk. 188 planes were destroyed, and 159 damaged. But the human toll was the worst. Over 2,000 people on the base were killed, 60 of them while eating breakfast. Another 1,178 were wounded. And America reeled with shock and horror. There are many battlegrounds that are haunted by the men who gave their lives there, but Pearl Harbor experiences a special kind of haunting, one even more tragic. The people, men and women, who were killed in the bombing at Pearl Harbor did not fall in combat. They had no warning of their impending deaths, and they had no idea they were even on a battlefield until it was far too late. Many of them, including the personnel on the sunken battleships, were never given proper burial. So it's not surprising that Pearl Harbor still teems with the spirits of those who lost their lives so suddenly. Paranormal phenomena have been reported all over Ford Island. Even residents of private homes on the island tell of phantom voices and footsteps, of lights that turn themselves on and off, and of shadowy figures that disappear when approached. One of the most well-known spirits on the site even has a name, although a nickname. Charlie has made his presence known so often that whenever a report of weirdness comes in, officers are likely to respond with a casual, "Oh, that's just Charlie." Charlie announces himself with loud footsteps and the jangling of keys in empty hallways. He also likes to turn radios on and scan between stations. Hangars 37 and 79 form part of the Pacific Aviation Museum. Ghostly happenings in these buildings include the sound of men talking at night when the buildings are deserted and phantom music playing. In the museum offices, lights go on and off, the motion detectors are triggered, even when no one is in the building. There is also a mannequin nicknamed Kramer who stands dressed in navy whites in front of a B-25 bomber at the museum. Kramer seems to have a mind of his own, because he'll change position overnight. Sometimes his arm is up at night and down at his side in the morning. Sometimes museum staff will come in for the day and see that Kramer has picked up a piece of paper overnight and is standing there holding it. Where did the paper come from? Kramer's not saying. Hawaiian Island ghost hunters did an investigation at the museum in 2009. They captured an extremely faint EVP while recording next to Kramer and the bomber. With the hiss removed, a voice seems to whisper, "I'm getting tired of goofing around." Parentheses. The 2-part video of the investigation can be viewed on YouTube. End parentheses. The most common area of Pearl Harbor is the sunken USS Arizona. The most haunted area of Pearl Harbor is the sunken USS Arizona. A white memorial stands guard above the wreck, and scores of tourists visit the site every day. The Arizona was the ship that suffered the most damage from the Japanese attack. She took 4 direct hits from 800-kilogram bombs. The last bomb struck a 14-inch powder magazine, which exploded with the impact. That was the death blow for the Arizona. 1,177 crewmen died with her. Most of the bodies remain in the ship, cradled in the warm, shallow waters of the harbor. Many photos taken at the memorial show strange, foggy spots, even misty human figures. One specific ghost is believed to be that of an officer who was posted on the deck of the Arizona that fateful morning. As the story goes, he left his post briefly to attend to some personal business, right before the attack. Now he blames himself for the ship's demise and wanders the deck forever. He is usually seen at night, at low tide, and in the pearly dawn mist over the wreck. Decades later, the fatally wounded Arizona is still bleeding. Oil still seeps from her ruptured sides, shimmering in the wicked opalescence on the water's calm surface. The Devaney family visited the memorial in 2011, and Susan Devaney took pictures as mementos of their visit. One picture, shown later on a CNN clip, seemed to show the sorrowful face of a young man looking up through the water. Was it simply a case of pareidolia caused by the Hawaiian sunlight glimmering off the oil slick water? Or was it something more? The attack on Pearl Harbor represented a blow to American innocence. The men and women who died there were simply going about their business on a Sunday morning in December when their world exploded. The spirits that haunt Pearl Harbor speak to us from a simpler time, a time defined by the greatest generation. Their voices are still heard today by those willing to listen. The disappearance of the Sodder children. There are 6 faces on the billboard, 5 children and a young man, a tantalizing glimpse of what could have been. The young man glances upwards, and his lips seem ready to curve into a smile. He's a good-looking kid, and a dead ringer for the solemn boy in the middle of the group of 5. But the 5 children aren't smiling. The youngest girl seems especially pensive. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty. These are the Sodder children. Their story is a curious, deeply frustrating mix of tragedy and hope, of loss and terrible yearning. Their story began in flames and ended in mystery. They are all dark-haired, dark-eyed, beautiful children. And on Christmas Eve, 1945, they disappeared. George and Jenny Sodder were a well-respected, solidly middle-class couple, Italian immigrants both. They had built a wonderful life together in the New World. George was born Giorgio Sadu in Tula, Sardinia, in 1895. He came to the United States in 1908 when he was 13 years old. His older brother came with him as far as Ellis Island, then returned to Italy, leaving George on his own. The resourceful young teen found work on the railroad in Pennsylvania, carrying water and supplies to the workers. George later moved to Smithers, West Virginia. He was smart and ambitious, and soon he had started his own trucking company, hauling freight and coal. One day, George went into a store called the Music Box and met the owner's daughter, Jenny Cipriani. She had been just 3 years old when her family came to the United States. George and Jenny married and had 10 children between 1923 and 1943. The rapidly growing family moved to Fayetteville, West Virginia. The little Appalachian town had a small but active Italian immigrant population. The Sodders quickly became one of the most respected families in the community. George was admired as a responsible businessman and a devoted father to his brood. He wasn't afraid to share his opinions, but in one area he was curiously silent. He avoided any talk of his past in the old country, and he never discussed why he chose to leave Italy. On Christmas Eve, 1945, the Sodder children opened their presents. 9 of the 10 children were still at home. One boy was serving in the army, but as World War II had ended that August, he was safe from harm. George and 2 of the boys, John and George Jr., went to bed early. The 2 boys helped their father in his trucking business. The other children were far too keyed up to sleep. They finally went to bed around 10 p.m. to dream of more Christmas cheer in the morning. Jenny took 2-year-old Sylvia, the youngest child, to her bedroom and put her down in her crib for the night. Jenny, too, went to bed. Around 12:30, the phone in George's office rang. Jenny woke up and went to answer it, before the shrill noise woke the household. An unfamiliar female voice was on the other end of the line. There seemed to be a party going on wherever the caller was. Jenny could hear raucous laughter in the background and the clink of glasses. Jenny sleepily told the woman she had the wrong number and hung up. On her way back to bed, Jenny noticed that the downstairs lights were on, the curtains were open, and the front door was unlocked. She put everything to rights. Marion was asleep on the couch in the living room, and Jenny assumed the other children were all tucked into their beds in the upstairs bedrooms. She went back to bed. As Jenny was drifting towards sleep, she heard one loud, sharp bang on the roof and a rolling noise. It sounded like something had hit the peak of the roof and rolled down to the gutter. Jenny listened, but no other noise came to her waiting ears. Her eyes closed, and she fell asleep, listening to the baby's soft breathing. An hour later, Jenny woke again, this time with a sense that something was terribly wrong. Then she realized that heavy smoke was curling into the room. She snatched Sylvia from her crib and hurried out of the bedroom, shouting for George. George met her out on the front lawn. John and George Jr. were also there, singed but safe. They shared an upstairs bedroom and had made their way downstairs through the growing flames at the cost of only some singed hair. Marion, too, was safely outside. But the roll call was dreadfully incomplete. 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were still in the house. The middle children shared 2 bedrooms on either side of the upstairs hallway, rooms that were separated by a staircase. And that staircase was now engulfed in flames. George couldn't get back into the house through the door, so he broke a window. He enlisted the glass that stripped the skin from his arm. The flames were still too intense for him to get into the house that way. George assumed, as did Jenny, that the middle children were still in their bedrooms, trapped by the encroaching flames. He knew he had to get to the upstairs bedroom windows to rescue them. He raced around to get the ladder he kept propped up against the side of the house, but it was gone. George was running out of options, and the fire department was nowhere in sight. He came up with a desperate plan. He would drive one of his coal trucks up to the house and stand on it to get to the upstairs windows. But despite having been running only hours before, neither one of his 2 trucks would start. Frantic, George tried to scoop water from a rain barrel next to the house, but the water was frozen solid. He could only stand, helpless, and watch his home burn. He couldn't even hear the children screaming. Meanwhile, Marion sprinted to a neighbor's house to call the Fayetteville Fire Department, but she couldn't get a hold of the operator. Another neighbor, who saw the fire as he was driving past, drove to a nearby tavern to call the fire department. Again, the operator wouldn't answer. Seething with frustration, the neighbor hopped back into his truck and drove into town. He woke Fire Chief F.J. Morris and told him that the solder home was on fire and that the children were still inside. The chief didn't know how to drive the fire truck, so he raised the alarm by using the fire department's phone tree. He called one fireman, who called another, and so on. The fire department was only 2.5 miles from the solder home, but the truck didn't get there until 8 a.m. Christmas morning. By then, the house was nothing but a charred, smoking hole in the ground. The solder's home had been destroyed in less than 45 minutes. George and Jenny were devastated. The distraught parents assumed that 5 of their children had died in the fire. By 10 a.m., Chief Morris had finished his investigation of the ruins. He hadn't found any human remains. But he assured the Solders that the fire had been hot enough to incinerate the bodies. He told the grieving parents to leave the site untouched, in case the fire department needed to investigate further. George waited for 4 days, but Morris didn't return. George covered the rubble in the basement with 5 feet of dirt, intending to plant a memorial garden for his lost children. On December 30th, 1945, the coroner's office issued 5 death certificates. They all gave fire or suffocation as a cause of death. But as the pain and horror of those first few days began to recede, George and Jenny Sauter realized that many questions were yet unanswered, and they couldn't shake the feeling they had that the children were still alive. As they pieced together the events leading up to the fire, some strange occurrences stood out. A few months earlier, in the fall, a stranger had come to the Sauter home looking for work with George's trucking company. He didn't get the job, but during his conversation with George, the stranger wandered to the rear of the house. He pointed at the fuse boxes and casually said, "This is going to cause a fire someday." George shrugged off the remark. The fuse boxes had just been inspected by the local power company, and they were in perfect condition. Harder to dismiss was another visitor who had come by the house at about the same time. This fellow was an insurance salesman who tried to sell the Sauters a life insurance policy. When George declined the offer, the man was furious. "Your GD house is going to go up in flames," the man snarled, "and your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini." It was true. George, a proud Italian, was an outspoken critic of the fascist dictator. And just before Christmas, the older Sauter sons had noticed a car parked along U.S. Highway 21. A man sitting in the car had been watching the younger children with unusual intensity as they came home from school. More questions arose with later investigation. The official cause of the fire was faulty wiring, but Jenny had seen lights on downstairs just an hour before the fire started. A telephone repairman showed the Sauters something interesting. Their phone lines had not been burned through, but rather had been cut, 14 feet off the ground and 2 feet from the utility pole. The ladder that was usually kept leaning against the house, the ladder that was missing when George tried to rescue his children, was found in a ravine near the house. And a man was accused of stealing a block and tackle from the Sauter property during the fire. Equipment that could easily have been used to dismantle the solder company trucks. Later, toddler Sylvia found a hard green rubber object in the yard. Jenny remembered the bang on the roof and the rolling sound. George identified it as a napalm pineapple bomb, and it seemed to the Sodders that the fire had consumed their house from the roof downwards. More frustrating of all was the lack of physical evidence of the children's deaths. Jenny, especially, just couldn't wrap her mind around it. How could 5 children perish in a fire and leave behind no bones at all? Out of curiosity, Jenny began to experiment. She burned bones from the family's dinner table, chicken bones, pork chop bones, even the joint from a beef roast, and the results were always the same. The fire never consumed the bones entirely. Jenny put the question to an employee at a crematorium who confirmed what she had suspected. Even when a body is cremated on purpose, burned for 2 hours at a constant 2,000 degrees, there are still charred bones left behind. The solder house fire was intense, but it raged fiercely for half an hour or so. It took only 45 minutes to burn to the ground. Also, Jenny had found household appliances in the basement rubble. The metal was charred, but still identifiable. To add to the mystery, people began to come forward with possible sightings of the children. A woman claimed she saw the missing children in a passing car while the house was still burning. Another woman, who ran a tourist rest area between Fayetteville and Charleston, said she saw the children the morning after the fire. She told police that she served them breakfast and that she had noticed a car with Florida plates in the rest stop parking lot. More tantalizing hearsay came from Charleston, about 50 miles west of Fayetteville. A woman who worked at a hotel there saw pictures of the missing children in a newspaper. She came forward to say that she had seen 4 of the 5 kids a week after the fire. In her statement, she said the children were accompanied by 2 women and 2 men, all of Italian extraction. I do not remember the exact date. However, the entire party did register at the hotel and stayed in a large room with several beds. They registered about midnight. I tried to talk to the children in a friendly manner, but the men appeared hostile and refused to allow me to talk to these children. One of the men looked at me in a hostile manner. He turned around and began talking rapidly in Italian. Immediately, the whole party stopped talking to me. I sensed I was being frozen out, and so I said nothing more. They left early the next morning. In 1947, George and Jenny asked the FBI for help. They received a personal letter from J. Edgar Hoover, but his reply was not encouraging. He wrote that it seemed to be a local case and not within the FBI's jurisdiction. Parentheses. This despite the Sodders' insistence that the children had been kidnapped and taken across state lines. In parentheses. A few FBI agents said they'd be willing to help with the case if they could get permission from local authorities, but the Fayetteville police and fire departments both refused the offer of federal help. The Sodders hired private investigator C.C. Tinsley, who turned up some very interesting facts. He found that the insurance salesman who had threatened George Sodder was also on the coroner's jury that ruled the fire accidental. That was intriguing, but Tinsley wasn't finished. He heard some interesting information regarding Fire Chief F.J. Morris from a minister in town. Morris had claimed that no human remains had been found on the site of the fire, but he let it slip to the minister that he'd found a heart in the ashes. He said he hid it in a dynamite box and buried it at the scene. This egregious act got Tinsley's attention immediately. He confronted Morris and persuaded him to return to the site and dig up the box. Morris did, with Tinsley at his side. They took it to a funeral director who found that it was not a heart at all. In fact, it wasn't even human. It was simply a chunk of beef liver. Later, the Sodders heard rumors that Morris had been desperate to find or plant any remains at the site, thinking that would placate the grieving parents and get them off his back. In 1949, Tinsley and the Sodders, along with Washington, D.C. pathologist Oscar B. Hunter, did a thorough excavation of the fire scene. The search uncovered several small objects, coins, a partially burned dictionary, and several shards of bone. Hunter sent the bones to the Smithsonian Institution for further examination. Their report determined that the bones represented 4 lumbar vertebrae from one individual who was at least 16 or 17 years old, but no older than 23. Again, this made no sense. The oldest missing child was Maurice, who was only 14 at the time of the fire. The report said it was possible, but not probable, that the bones of a 14-year-old boy could show the maturation of a 16-year-old. To further complicate things, the bones show no signs that they'd ever been exposed to fire. Whoever wrote the report even found it strange that in a situation where searchers expected to find evidence of 5 bodies, the only sign of any remains were 4 vertebrae. The report concluded that the bones were probably in the fill dirt that George had bulldozed over the burnt out basement to create a memorial garden for his children. Tinsley later managed to trace the bones to a cemetery in Mount Hope, West Virginia. What bones from an unidentified grave were doing in the dirt at the Sauter home was just another part of the mystery. The case of the missing Sauter children was declared hopeless by Governor Oki L. Patterson and State Police Superintendent W. E. Burchett. But the Sauter family hadn't yet given up hope. In 1952, they pulled up a billboard along. In 1952, they put up a billboard along U.S. Highway 16 near Ansted, West Virginia. The solemn faces of the missing children gazed from the billboard as the headline above them shrieked, "What was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive?" The family handed out flyers advertising a $5,000 reward. Later, they increased the amount to $10,000. Slim leads crept in from time to time. George saw a picture of some school children in New York City and swore he recognized his daughter Betty, the youngest of the missing children. He went to Manhattan to investigate, but the parents of the girl refused to speak to him. A letter came from St. Louis. A woman said that Martha, the oldest missing daughter, was in a convent there. In Texas, a tavern patron overheard a conversation about a mysterious Christmas Eve fire in West Virginia. And from Florida, a word came that the children were staying with distant relatives of Jenny's. George investigated every single lead, but every time his search came up empty. Then in 1968, over 20 years after the fire, an envelope arrived in the mail. It was addressed only to Jenny. It bore a Kentucky postmark, but no return address. Jenny opened the mysterious envelope. Inside was a photograph of a dark-haired, dark-eyed young man in his mid-20s. Jenny turned the photograph over with trembling fingers. On the back was a cryptic note. Louis Sauter. I love Brother Frankie. Ill boys, or before this was a secret message. Okay. All right, so hang on a second. Louis Sauter. I love Brother Frankie. I little boys. A90132 or 35. If this was a secret message from Louis, sent to reassure his family of his safety, it didn't answer many questions. But the young man in the picture bore an undeniable resemblance to Louis Sauter, who was 9 years old at the time of the fire. In fact, he was very nearly 10. He would have celebrated his birthday 5 days later. George and Jenny hired another detective and sent him off to Kentucky to investigate. They never heard back from the man. Nevertheless, they added the picture of the handsome young man to the billboard on U.S. Highway 16, and they enlarged the photo and hung it over the fireplace. The boy did so look like Louis, and if there was even a slim chance it was him, now they had a tenuous connection with one of the missing children. Every single clue pointed to the 5 Sauter children having survived the fire. All the evidence shouted that they were still alive and out there in the world, somewhere. But where? Aside from that one cryptic photograph and a handful of possible sightings, the Sauter children were gone, like wisps of smoke in the wind. George Sauter died in 1968. He never stopped believing that someday his children would come home to him. Jenny retreated into her home and built several additions onto it, making a bulwark between herself and the world. She wore the black of mourning from the day after the fire until her own death in 1989. After Jenny's passing, the family took the billboard down. By that time, there was really no use in leaving it up any longer. The last Sauter child, Sylvia, is in her early 70s. She still keeps tabs on any possible news about her missing siblings. There are no ghosts in this story, only a deep and abiding mystery. There are no ghosts, only 2 grieving parents who lost half their family in one terrifying night. There are no ghosts unless you count the 5 young faces that kept watch from the billboard for so many lonely years, their solemn gazes staring down the West Virginia highway. There are no ghosts, only questions. The Weinkauf Hotel fire. In the first half of the 20th century, the United States was haunted by fire. The memory of 1911 was still fresh in the public mind. That was the year that the fire had broken out on the top three floors of the 10-story ash building. The building, touted as fireproof, had failed to live up to its billing of 146 employees of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. 123 of them, young women, had died in the blaze. The early years of the 1940s had been especially lethal. In 1940, 198 people had been killed in a fire at a dance hall in Natchez, Mississippi. 2 years later, in November 1942, the Coconut Grove Club in Boston was the scene of the deadliest nightclub fire in history, when 492 people died and hundreds more were injured. And on July 6, 1944, 168 people, mostly women and children, perished when fire broke out in a Ringling Brothers circus tent in Hartford, Connecticut. 2 years after that, the possibility of fire was still very much on people's minds, but life goes on. In early December 1946, soldiers were coming home from Europe and the Pacific, and America was still celebrating the Allied victory in World War II. The country was just entering the post-war boom, and people were eager to start their Christmas shopping. The Weinkauf Hotel on Peachtree Street in downtown Atlanta was sold out for the weekend. Folks had come to Atlanta for an early start on Christmas shopping, and high school students from all over the state were in town for a youth assembly sponsored by the YMCA at the Georgia State Capitol. The hotel was packed, with 280 guests in the building's rooms. 280 guests in the building's rooms. Sorry. The Weinkauf Hotel, built in 1913, was 15 floors high, a steel structure enclosed in concrete. This absolutely fireproof hotel was designed and built without sprinklers, fire escapes, or an alarm system. However, the building met code, so when fire completely destroyed the magnificent Weinkauf Mansion on Peachtree Circle on December 8, 1913, William F. Weinkauf and his wife Grace moved into the penthouse on the 16th floor of their newly built hotel. The Weinkaufs were probably pretty conscious of fire safety after the loss of their lavish mansion. At any rate, they felt secure enough in the hotel's design to make it their new home. But when a fire broke out on the third floor in the early morning hours of December 7th, it spread quickly through the building. The single central staircase acted as a hellish chimney, directing toxic smoke to the upper floors. Flames chewed through the rooms filled with wooden furniture, upholstered chairs, draperies, and wooden Venetian blinds. The walls of the rooms were covered with painted burlap fabric, from the wooden baseboard to a chair rail 4 feet above the floor. From the chair rail to the ceiling, the walls were covered with up to 5 layers of wallpaper. Wooden molding provided a decorative touch where the walls met the ceiling. The voracious fire devoured it all. The Atlanta Fire Department got an alarm call at 3:42 a.m. Fire Chief Charles Styron arrived at the scene with the first trucks. He soon sent out a second alarm call, then a third. Styron eventually summoned help from fire departments outside the city. More than 40 fire trucks converged on the scene, 32 pumping engines, 4 aerial ladder trucks, 6 service ladder trucks, a floodlight truck, and a salvage and rescue truck. The aerial ladders would be crucial in saving lives because the Weinkauf had no fire escapes. The city fire department only had 5 aerial ladders. The problem was that the ladders on the trucks were too short. Chief Styron had been trying to order an additional 85-foot ladder truck for several years. But with factories retooled for war production, there was simply none to be had. Styron believed that any ladder over 85 feet long was unsafe. He knew that 2 longer ladders had collapsed under their loads in other cities. And indeed, during the fire, the city's longest aerial ladder truck, with a 100-foot ladder, went out of service when the hydraulic system failed. Styron quickly moved an 85-foot ladder into position on Ellis Street to replace the longer one, leaving 2 trucks on Peachtree Street, a 75-foot ladder, and a 55-foot mini aerial. But all this maneuvering was in vain, because the Weinkauf Hotel was 155 feet tall. The fire truck's ladders were simply and tragically too short to save people trapped on the upper floors. The ladders couldn't reach guests above the 8th floor. People above that floor had 3 options. They could fashion sheet ropes and slide down them to the tops of the ladders. They could wait out the fire and hope that the firefighters could save the building, or they could jump for a net. People who chose to jump from the lower floors were generally okay, but the nets were not designed to catch jumpers from higher floors. Many nets ripped on impact, spilling victims onto the pavement. Also, many people didn't realize how hard it would be to hit a target from 80 feet or more in the air. At the front of the building, the marquee was in the way of the jumpers. One woman, aiming for a net, impaled herself on a steel cable jutting from the marquee. Some would-be rescuers tried to put boards and ladders between the windows of the hotel and the windows of the mortgage guarantee building next door. This worked, but barely. The heights of the floors didn't match, and the ladders ended up canted at a 30-degree angle over a 10-foot distance. Some people did try to wait out the fire, trusting the firefighters to do their job and save the building. One man and two women in a room tried to wet down everything they possibly could so that the room wouldn't explode when the fire gases were ignited by the heat. They filled the tub and sinks with water and stepped up and stopped up the toilet. But when the mattress began to smolder and the water standing on the floor near the door started to boil, they decided it was time to leave. One man, Reed Home, went to a window, took out his wallet, and pulled out five $20 bills. One by one, he wadded them up and dropped them out the windows of his room, trying to aim so the bills would land at the feet of the five different people. He figured some people deserved to be lucky that morning. Reed and his wife Carrie survived the fire and were let out of the building by firemen when the fire was out. Other people took their chances with sheet ropes. Gladys Mitchell, on the 16th floor, put her long black fur coat on over her nightgown before trying to climb down a sheet rope to an aerial ladder. Ann Smith was climbing down the rope after her. Ann lost her grip and fell, knocking Gladys off on the way down. Ann's body plummeted to the street, but Gladys's left arm hit the steel cable supporting the Weinkauf sign. The cable snapped under the impact, and the ricochet wrapped the end of the cable around her arm. The long sleeve of the fur coat prevented Gladys's arm from being ripped off and saved her life. From the first alarm at 3:42 a.m. until 6:04 a.m., when the last flames were doused, the Weinkauf hotel fire officially lasted 142 minutes. The death toll was 119, an average of one death nearly every minute. 32 guests died from injuries suffered from falling or jumping. 40 suffocated on toxic fumes, and 37 were listed as burn fatalities, although it was believed they had succumbed to the fumes before being burned. More than 80% of the deaths happened above the 8th floor, beyond the reach of the aerial ladders. 16 people died on the 12th floor alone. 40% of the Weinkauf's more than 280 guests had died. William and Grace Weinkauf themselves were among the casualties. They perished in their 16th floor penthouse. A third of the survivors, 64 people, had to be hospitalized. Some of them died at the hospital, including 24-year-old Edith Birch, who died just before midnight on Sunday. She had been climbing down a sheet rope when she fell and plunged through the canopy of the hotel. She survived the fall, but broke both arms and legs and suffered internal injuries. Her husband, George Birch, had come down the sheet rope after Edith. He was at her side when she died at the hospital. They had been married 6 months. Nearly 90 bodies had to be removed from the building. Most victims on the lower and middle floors had burned after suffocating. One body was so hot, firemen had to hose it down before it could be lifted onto a stretcher. Charred flesh fell apart at the slightest touch. If the firemen found whiskey in the hotel rooms, they took swigs of it for courage. Firemen opened one door and found a pretty young woman sitting by the window. She was wearing a green dress, and her eyes were still open. She appeared to be simply sitting near the window, calmly waiting for rescue. But she was dead. Several high school students perished in the fire. The parents of Francis Thompson and Gwen McCoy, two seniors from Gainesville, could not distinguish between the charred body of the two girls. The friends were buried together, and they share a headstone. Authors Sam Hayes and Alan B. Goodwin described the scene in their book, The Weinkauf Fire, The Untold Story of America's Deadliest Hotel Fire. The scene that met the firemen's gaze was one of utter surreal devastation. Light bulbs had melted in the heat of the fire and dripped in long glass stalactites from their sockets. Telephones were shapeless blobs of black plastic. Wooden blades of ceiling fans had burned away. Clothes had turned to charcoal in hangers and closets. Toilets were cracked. The water in the necks of the fixtures had boiled, then turned into steam and exploded the porcelain. On Christmas Day in 1971, 162 people died in a fire at the Hotel Teokale in Seoul, South Korea. With that tragedy, the Weinkauf Hotel no longer held the dubious honor of being the worst hotel fire in the world. It remains, however, the worst in United States history. The fire at Our Lady of the Angels School. Queen of Heaven Cemetery in the Chicago suburb of Hillside is a beautiful, restful spot, green in the Illinois summer and dotted with color from the flowers left at the graves of loved ones. It's a place to reflect on lives lived and lost, a place where the living can go find peace and comfort, a place where the dead can be remembered with dignity. One of the countless memorials here is a blocky stone monument covered with names. The Virgin Mary stands in high relief on one side of the block, her head bowed and her hands outstretched in welcome. This is not a fancy Renaissance style sculpture. Mary is dressed in a simple robe, and a small halo shines behind her veiled head. The message on the monument is simple too. Our Lady of the Angels, pray for us. This is the memorial of the 92 students and 3 nuns who perished in the fire of Our Lady of the Angels grade school on December 1st, 1958. This tragedy led to a complete overhaul of the school safety regulations. It is still considered one of the most awful and horrifying events in Chicago's history. The Blessed Virgin Mary Order of Nuns was founded in 1833 by Sister Mary Frances Clark. In 1867, the order devoted to education began serving in the Chicago Archdiocese. The nuns of the order were very concerned about fire safety, and with good reason. In 1870, their mother house in Dubuque, Iowa, had burned to the ground. Since then, for 88 years, every member of the order included in their daily prayers a request that they and their students be spared from fire. Our Lady of the Angels Grade School at 3820 West Iowa Street in Chicago's Humboldt Park neighborhood was one of the schools served by these nuns. Many Catholic families attended the school, with siblings filling several grades. 1958 was right in the middle of the baby boom, too. With around 1,400 students enrolled at the school, classrooms were very overcrowded. Sister DeVitas recalled that when the Monsignor came to her classroom to hand out report cards, she had to thread her way between an extra couple of rows of desks to meet him at the classroom door. December 1st, 1958 was a cold and cloudless day in the Chicago suburbs. It was a Monday, and the students were back at their desks after the weekend. The children had eaten lunch, and afternoon classes had begun. The fire began after 2:20 p.m. in a 30-gallon trash can at the bottom of the stairwell. The cardboard trash can, with metal rings at the top and bottom to hold it together, was full of paper. After burning through all the paper, the fire smoldered for a while in the confined space under the stairwell. 3 walls covered in sheet metal reflected and intensified the heat. The heat continued to build, and finally a window shattered. Oxygen was sucked into the area, causing the smoldering fire in the garbage can to flare up. The flames spread to the wooden staircase, varnished woodwork, and walls covered with 14 layers of paint. The top 2 layers were particularly flammable. Custodians had used rubberized plastic paint. As it burned, it produced a heavy toxic black smoke. The stairwell turned into a giant chimney. The fire was stopped from entering the first floor corridor by the fire doors, but it swept up the stairway and devoured the 85-foot-long hallway that led to the second-floor classrooms, burning it over 1,400 degrees. One reason the fire was such a deadly inferno was because of the roof. Over the years, the roof had been sealed several times with hot tar, the new layer being poured over the old. If the old tar had been stripped off before applying a new roof, the fire could have burned through the roof and vented itself. As it was, the multiple layers of tar acted as an impermeable seal. Acted as an as an impermeable seal. Great for keeping rain off and fire in. Under that seal, the fire was trapped, insatiable, a dragon roaring out of control. Hot air and gases continued to flow up from the basement. They were inside the wall now, feeding through an open shaft that had once held a drinking fountain, now disconnected. The flames filled the small attic above the second-floor ceiling, moving towards the 6 classrooms of the north wing packed with 329 students and 6 teachers. These secondary flames found their way through 2 ventilation grilles in the ceiling and dropped down to the second-floor hallway, joining the primary fire. The first sign of trouble in room 209 came when a student was going about his daily chore of collecting waste paper from his classmates. When he bent to pick up the metal garbage basket near the back of the room, for some reason the basket felt hot. Just then, another student told Sister DeVitas, the teacher, that he smells something burning. When teacher and student tried to open the door to the hallway, smoke poured into the classroom. The inferno raged through the second floor hallway. The glass transom windows over the classroom doors shattered from the intense heat. Smoke and flames poured into the classrooms over the transoms, caught the flammable ceiling tiles on fire, and forced the students towards the windows. Here, younger students ran into their own difficulties trying to escape the flames. The window ledges were 37.5 inches off the floor, too high for little kids to scramble over. Some students, trusting their teacher when she told them to pray for help, sat quietly at their desk as they'd been told, folded their hands, and prayed, watching as the paint on the walls changed color from white to tan to brown. Firemen fought their way into one classroom to find 24 children sitting dead at their desks. Their books were still open in front of them. The fire alarm rang only inside the school. It didn't transmit a signal to the fire department. When the fire trucks did arrive, they went first to the wrong address because a housekeeper had phoned in the alarm from the rectory next door to the school. The scene that met the firefighters was among the worst ever encountered by first responders in the history of American fire service. The smoke conditions were horrifying, even for trained professionals. Their thick black toxic smoke poured from the building, making entry difficult, and breathing apparatus equipment for the firefighters didn't exist in 1958. It might not have helped the firefighters battle their way through the smoke-filled classrooms anyway. According to one fire chief who fought the blaze, it wouldn't have made any difference. The smoke was so bad, all you would have had was a bunch of dead firemen. The firefighters tried their best, though. They rescued 160 students from the flames. The injured students and teachers were taken to St. Anne's and to other hospitals on the city's west side. St. Anne's, being the closest to the school, ended up with the most casualties, almost twice as many as the other hospitals combined. Luckily, the fire happened during a 3 o'clock shift change, meaning that twice the number of hospital staff was present when the injured started pouring in. At St. Anne's, 37 children and 3 nuns were admitted. Of those, 10 children and 1 nun were dead on arrival. 2 more students died before they could be admitted. The number of victims was horrifying. 90 students and 3 nuns were injured, not only from burns and smoke inhalation, but also from jumping to escape the fire. The deaths were even more appalling. The fire claimed the lives of 92 children and 3 nuns. The school was woefully unprepared for a fire. There were no smoke detectors and no sprinkler system. There were fire doors, but only on the first door. And there was only one fire escape for the entire building. Unbelievably, the school had passed a safety inspection only 2 months before. The response to the fire was immediate. At Cook County Jail, inmates lined up to donate blood. At State-Filled Prison in Joliet, inmates gave up their cigarettes and candy rations, donating the money to the fire fund. The tragedy was reported all over the world. The BBC called the fire too awful for words. The response of the Catholic Church, meanwhile, was somewhat muted. Although the Archdiocese was just as devastated by the tragedy as neighborhood families were, they were ill-equipped to provide any real relief. Catholic Charities sent priests and nuns out into the neighborhood, but their role was to console the survivors, not to provide counseling for them. Consolation was needed, as well as counseling. One of the most heart-wrenching tales to arise from the tragedy was the experience of Stanley Berta. On the day of the fire, Berta was occupying a bed in Cook County Hospital on Polk Street. This was a place where folks down on their luck could come for inexpensive health care, and Berta had more than his share of bad luck recently. A week or so before, Berta had been laid off from his job at Bowman Dairy. This worried him, and he had a wife and 4 kids to support. Then on the day after Thanksgiving, he'd been chopping wood in the basement, and a piece of metal, either from an axe or a stray nail, flew up and struck his left eye. Berta was taken to Cook County, where he had an operation to remove the shard of metal from his eye. As he lay in the hospital after the surgery, Berta must have been asking himself, what else could possibly go wrong? That's when a priest came in and told Berta that his oldest child, 13-year-old Beverly Ann, had been killed in the fire at Our Lady of the Angels. She'd been taken to Cook County morgue and was now lying on a cold metal table right across the street from the hospital where her father had his eye operation. Berta clambered out of his hospital bed and went in search of his doctor. He had to go home and had to be with his wife. His doctor released him, but he warned Bertie not to cry. If you cry, the salt from your tears might scald your eye, the doctor said. If that happens, it could blind you. Berta's response? God's will be done. Some of the parishioners of Our Lady of Angels found it difficult to accept God's will in the weeks and months after the tragedy. For the children who escaped the fire, survivors' guilt was compounded by the religious teachings of the Catholic Church. The nuns explained to the children that only the good ones were taken. Using kid logic to puzzle this out, many survivors came to the conclusion that if the good ones had died, and if they themselves had survived, they must be bad. One of the survivors, Mary Jane Lucio Cozy, was in 5th grade at the time of the fire. She escaped the fire unharmed. She shared her feelings years later. Quote, the ones who died were called the lucky ones, the chosen ones. They were the ones God wanted. Those of us who lived weren't chosen. They were the angels. We were the kids who were left behind. And the parents whose children had died were being handed a lot of nonsense too. They were being told their child was now an angel in heaven, but they were angry as hell about it. Yet how could they be angry if that's what God wanted for them? Shame on you if you're crying and being angry when God chose your child, when you really are a blessed person because you've got your own personal angel in heaven. It was so backward, so ludicrous. The fire at Our Lady of the Angels school gave rise to many amazing stories. Some parishioners had mysterious premonitions. One mother had an unsettling vision of her small son in a casket on the evening before the fire. Linda Malinsky, just looking real quick. Okay. Linda Malinsky, 10 years old and in the 5th grade, woke up crying from a nightmare Sunday night. When her mother came running to see what was wrong, Linda cried, Mommy, I can't breathe. Linda had asthma and it had woven its way into her dream. She had a nightmare that her family's apartment was on fire, filling with smoke, and she woke up coughing. Her mother calmed her down, reassuring the young girl that everything was fine. As Linda calmed down, she sleepily mumbled, Mommy, I hear people screaming. Linda and her brother both stayed home from school sick Monday morning, but felt better after lunch. Mary Malinsky took her children's temperatures and decided they were both well enough to go to school for afternoon classes. Linda died in the fire. Her brother survived. There were several reports of crisis apparitions at the time of the fire. One woman said that her parents had come to the school to look for her and her brother. They found the girl and the mother, looked up to see the boy running toward his parents with a big smile on his face. In the milling confusion, though, the parents lost track of the boy. Hours later, they learned to their horror that he hadn't left the school at all. He had died in the second-floor classroom. To her dying day, the woman's mother was convinced she'd seen her son outside the school that day. Another story tells of a boy who searched frantically for his sister in the chaos outside the school. He spotted her a block away, walking in the direction of their home. He sagged with the relief of knowing his sister was safe, but when he got home, he found out that his sister had indeed perished. Many of the little ghosts came back with words of comfort for the grieving families. Don't worry, one girl's spirit told her devastated brother. I'm going to watch over you. Another ghost sat with his mother and held her hand after she had been to the morgue to identify his body. People still claim to smell smoke at the memorial in Queen of Heaven Cemetery, where 25 of the children who died are buried. And a student at the school built to replace Our Lady of the Angels told of hearing screams in the hallway at the new school. She filled page after page of drawing paper with sketches of the faces she saw in her dreams, faces of the fire victims. You see how long this next one is? Okay, we're going to call it right there. I've got a place I have to be tonight, but I want to thank you guys for coming and listening, and I really appreciate it. Let me turn this off. Interesting book. Okay. A lot of tragedy. It's amazing what goes on, during the holiday season and wintertime, really. And yeah. Anyway, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. Tomorrow, again, Dr. Bruce Goldberg will be on. And we'll be discussing the Philadelphia experiment. And for those who don't know what Philadelphia experiment is, that was allegedly, I'm saying allegedly because we don't know, that was allegedly the government trying to create the ability to teleport things, and that was the USS Eldridge that allegedly was teleported from one port to another, from one tie down port to another. So we're going to be talking about that tomorrow. Again, if you're watching from Facebook and you like listening to me read, please hit that follow button and share it with your friends to let them know that there's a fool sitting here reading every Sunday for an hour, and it's always a paranormal themed book. So yeah, and this book by Sylvia Schultz is really good, actually. If you're watching from YouTube and you like what you hear, please hit the like button and hit that little ghost that's down at the bottom right hand corner of the screen, and that'll subscribe you to our videos. And we have over 450 videos over on YouTube. Anyway, I want to thank you guys for coming tonight, and I will see you tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Pacific. Have a great evening.